Fiona Marsh had already learned that hope arrives without warning and never asks permission. It came for her again at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in a hospital parking garage, 6 weeks after the ward she loved was dissolved from beneath her. With a stranger's voice on the phone and a name she had never heard, about to hand her a wilderness lodge in northern Ontario, and with it, a secret sealed inside cold Canadian rock for more than 50 years. In the autumn of 2023, Fiona Marsh was 32 years old and quietly falling apart. She had been a registered nurse at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto for 6 years, a job she had loved completely and without reservation, until the health authorities' restructuring swept through her ward like a frost and left 42 nurses, including Fiona, without positions. The severance covered 2 months of rent. After that came the credit cards, then the line of credit, then the deeply humiliating phone calls to her bank about repayment plans. She had no family to lean on. Her mother, Carol, had died of ovarian cancer when Fiona was 19. Her father had left when she was 4, and existed now only as a vague, useless memory of someone who smelled like pine resin and cigarettes. She had no siblings. She had her apartment in Parkdale, her scrubs, her nursing certification, and approximately $800 left in a checking account that had once held considerably more. She was sitting in her car in the hospital parking garage after dropping off a reference letter for a colleague when her phone rang. The number had a 705 area code she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Marsh?" The voice on the other end was elderly, deliberate, formal in the way that people who have spent decades in law firms tend to become. "My name is Gerald Holt. I'm a solicitor practicing in Sudbury, Ontario. I'm calling in regard to the estate of the late Agnes Bellwood." Fiona had never heard that name in her life. She said so. "Yes," Gerald Holt said, not particularly surprised. "That's rather what I expected you to say. Nevertheless, Ms. Marsh, I would very much appreciate it if you could find the time to come to my office at your earliest convenience." Agnes Bellwood passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 89. She was the sole owner of Bellwood Lake Lodge, a 63-acre wilderness property on the eastern shore of Lake Temagami. According to her last will and testament, she has left the entire estate, the lodge, the 12 guest cabins, the boathouse, the equipment, and all remaining assets, to you. The parking garage hummed with fluorescent light. Somewhere below, a car alarm was going off. "Mr. Holt," Fiona said carefully, "I think you have the wrong person. I've never been to Temagami. I've never met anyone named Agnes Bellwood." "I understand your confusion, Miss Marsh. Agnes was very particular in her instructions, however. She provided your full legal name, your date of birth, your Ontario health card number, and the name of the street you grew up on in Barrie." A brief pause. "Sunnyside Avenue." Fiona's throat tightened. She had told almost no one where she grew up. There was no reason a stranger in Sudbury should know that. "When do you need me there?" she asked. She drove north 3 days later. Gerald Holt's office was on a quiet street downtown, wedged between a Vietnamese restaurant and an accounting firm. He was a small, white-haired man in his late 70s who wore a corduroy jacket and looked at Fiona across his desk, the way a doctor looks at a patient before delivering news that will change everything. He explained the inheritance clearly, without embellishment. The property, the land, the boathouse, the dock, all of it was hers. Then he explained the condition. Agnes Bellwood had stipulated, in language that Gerald described as airtight, that before the deed could be transferred into Fiona's name, and before she could legally list the property for sale, she must reside continuously at the lodge for 45 days. Not 44, 45. She could not leave the property for more than 18 hours at a stretch. If she violated this condition, the estate would revert entirely to the Temagami Land Conservancy. "The lodge has been operating at reduced capacity since Agnes's health declined," Gerald said, folding his hands. "The last paying guests left in June of last year. The roof on the main building needs significant work. The access road off Highway 11 is rough at the best of times. And I should tell you, Ms. Marsh, that Agnes's nephew has already contacted my office twice to dispute the will. What's his name? Russell Bellwood. Gerald said it without expression, but something in the careful flatness of his voice told Fiona the name carried weight. He's been trying to get his hands on that property for years. He's well-funded and not particularly patient. I'd advise you to be careful. Fiona thought about her $800. She thought about the eviction notice that was probably already being drafted. She thought about what 63 acres of Ontario lakefront property would sell for in a market that had never really cooled. "Where do I sign?" she said. She drove to Temagami on a Thursday in October, the maples burning orange and red on either side of the Trans-Canada, the sky the flat, colourless white of coming weather. The turn-off for Bellwood Lake Lodge was unmarked. She would have missed it entirely if Gerald hadn't drawn her a map on the back of an envelope. The access road was worse than rough. It was a 15-minute crawl over exposed Canadian Shield bedrock and muddy ruts that scraped the undercarriage of her Civic 3 separate times. The lodge appeared through the tree line all at once, and Fiona stopped the car. It was enormous. A 3-story log building, dark with age, with a wide covered veranda that wrapped around the front and sides. The 12 guest cabins were strung along the lakeshore to the north, their roofs sagging under decades of snow load, their windows filmed with algae. The dock extended 60 feet into Lake Temagami, several boards missing entirely. The boathouse listed slightly to starboard. Beyond all of it, the lake itself was pewter grey and enormous and utterly silent. There were no birds. That was the thing Fiona noticed first. For a wilderness property in October, there were no birds at all. "You're the Marsh girl." She spun around. A man was standing at the edge of the tree line, watching her. He was in his late 60s, lean and weathered in the way of someone who has spent most of his life outdoors, with thick white hair beneath a worn canvas cap and dark eyes that were measuring her with frank, unhurried appraisal. He held a canvas duffel bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. "Walter Cruikshank," he said, not moving toward her. "I've got a cabin at the north end of the property. Agnes let me stay there in exchange for looking after the boats and the dock. She said you'd be coming." "She knew I was coming?" Fiona asked. "She knew before she died?" "She knew quite a bit." Walter set the duffel down and looked at her steadily. "She left you the place for a reason, Miss Marsh, but you should understand what you're walking into. Agnes didn't die peacefully, she died frightened. I spent her last 3 months driving her to appointments in North Bay, and every single time we passed the turnoff to this road, she grabbed my arm." He paused. "Whatever is in that building, she spent 60 years making sure nobody found it, and Russell Bellwood has spent the last 10 years trying to prove it exists." "Trying to prove what exists?" Walter looked at the lake for a long moment. "Get settled," he said. "I'll bring firewood at 6. He turned and walked back into the trees. The first week at Bellwood Lake Lodge rewired Fiona's nervous system entirely. The main building was cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Cold in the way that very old places are cold, as though the walls have absorbed decades of silence and are slowly exhaling them. The electricity worked, barely. The wood stove in the main common room was her only reliable heat source. She slept in Agnes's bedroom on the 3rd floor, which was the warmest room in the building, and woke each night to sounds that the old logs made as the temperature dropped, sounds that were almost, but not quite, footsteps. She told herself it was the building settling. She was a nurse. She understood the mechanics of anxiety. She was familiar with the way an exhausted and stressed mind will build monsters out of ambient noise. On the 5th day, she began to explore. The lodge was a labyrinth of connected rooms that Agnes had clearly used for storage in her later years. Fishing gear, old guest ledgers dating back to the 1950s, boxes of linen, broken furniture, a taxidermied pike the size of a child mounted on a board. The kitchen was enormous and outdated, the industrial range from the 1970s still functional. There was a small office off the main lobby, its walls covered in framed photographs of guests over the decades, handwritten thank you notes pinned to a corkboard, a calendar from 2019, still flipped to June. She was going through the filing cabinet in the office when she found the locked drawer. It was the bottom drawer of a heavy steel cabinet, and it had a small padlock through the handle loop that was newer than everything else in the room. The brass still shiny, the mechanism smooth. Whatever Agnes had been protecting in her last years, this drawer was where she kept it. Fiona spent 20 minutes looking for the key before giving up and using a letter opener to spring the lock. It took considerable violence and left a deep gouge in the cabinet, but it worked. Inside the drawer was a single unsealed envelope, and beneath it a photograph. She picked up the photograph first. It was black and white, printed on the thick paper stock of the early 1970s. Two women, young, probably early 20s, standing on the dock outside. The dock shorter then, the lodge behind them freshly painted white. One woman was sharp-featured, confident, her chin tilted in a way that suggested she was accustomed to being in charge. The other was smaller, softer, with high cheekbones and a watchful expression, and the exact same wide-set dark eyes that Fiona had been looking at in mirrors her entire life. Fiona turned the photograph over. Written on the back in a careful, elegant hand, Agnes and Marion. The summer everything changed, 1971. Marion. Her grandmother. Fiona's grandmother, who had died before Fiona was born, and who her mother had spoken of rarely and always briefly. A Métis woman from northern Ontario, who had moved to Barrie in the early 1970s and never looked back, who had died when Carol was still a teenager, who had apparently left nothing behind worth inheriting. Fiona sat down on the office floor. Her legs simply stopped supporting her. What had her grandmother been doing at this lodge in 1971? Why was she in a photograph with Agnes Bellwood? And why had Agnes Bellwood left her entire estate to a granddaughter Marion never mentioned? She opened the envelope. Inside was a single index card in Agnes's handwriting, the letters shaky and compressed the way handwriting becomes in very old age. The truth is in the icehouse. Marion said you'd know what to do with it. I hope she was right. The sound of a vehicle engine broke through her thoughts. She was on her feet and at the lobby window in seconds. A black Range Rover was coming up the access road, moving much faster than the road allowed, and behind it a second vehicle, a white pickup truck with Ontario plates. The Range Rover stopped in front of the veranda. The man who got out was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had played hockey seriously through his 30s, with the kind of expensive casual clothes, fleece vest, technical pants, proper boots, that signal money working hard to look like it isn't. He had a face that might have been handsome if it weren't quite so deliberate. Fiona opened the front door before he could knock. Russell Bellwood, the man said, with a smile that didn't connect to his eyes. And you must be Fiona. I'm glad you're here, actually. Saves me a drive to Toronto. Mr. Holt's office has my contact information, Fiona said. Any communication about the estate should go through him. Gerald is a wonderful old man who is completely out of his depth. Russell's smile held. My aunt was not well in her final years, Fiona. I don't mean that unkindly. She was 89, and she was frightened and confused, and she made some decisions that don't reflect her genuine wishes. He looked past Fiona into the lobby, a quick scanning look that she recognized. It was the look of someone cataloguing a room, not admiring it. This property has been in the Bellwood family since 1948. My grandfather built this lodge with his own hands. Whatever Agnes's intentions were, the appropriate outcome is for it to remain in the family. I understand that's your position, Fiona said. Probate court will sort it out. Here's the thing about probate court. Russell reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded paper, which he held out to her. Fiona didn't take it. That process takes 18 to 24 months, during which time you'll be responsible for the property taxes, the liability insurance, the cost of the environmental assessment that's coming due, and the structural inspection that the roof absolutely requires before next winter. Conservative estimate, you're looking at $60,000 to $80,000 in carrying costs before you see a cent. His voice was pleasant, practical, the voice of a man accustomed to negotiating. I'm prepared to offer you $120,000 today. Wire transfer. You get in your car, you drive back to Toronto, and this whole unpleasant situation goes away. $120,000. Fiona was very still. She thought about her bank account. She thought about the phone calls with the collections department. She thought about the photograph on the office floor with her grandmother's eyes looking back at her. Why does this property matter to you that much? She asked. The cabins need new roofs. The dock is half rotted. The lodge hasn't had a paying guest in over a year. Something moved behind Russell's eyes very quickly and then was gone. Sentimental value, he said. You know what I think? Fiona said. I think you know exactly what's in that ice house. The pleasantness left Russell's face the way color leaves a wound. Be very careful, he said quietly. You don't know this property. You don't know this area. Women have gotten lost in that bush and never come back, and people up here mind their own business. He paused. Take the money. This is the only time I'm going to offer it. Fiona closed the door. She threw the deadbolt and stood in the dark lobby with her back against the door, listening to Russell get back in his Range Rover, listening to both vehicles back down the access road. She waited until the engine sound disappeared completely before she moved. She went back to the office and picked up Agnes's index card, the ice house. Walter found her standing behind the main lodge, staring at a low concrete structure built into a shaded hillside, its roof covered in decades of leaf litter, its wooden door weathered to grey. He had his thermos and his usual expression of patient observation. Agnes never let anyone near this, he said, coming to stand beside her. My grandmother was here, Fiona said. In 1971, Agnes knew her. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Marion Belcourt, he said finally. Fiona stared at him. You knew her name. Agnes talked about her sometimes. Near the end, when she wasn't sleeping well, she talked about Marion quite a bit. He looked at the ice house door. Agnes carried something for a long time. Whatever it was, I don't think she ever put it down. Fiona pulled the door open. The ice house was dim and cold, the heavy insulated walls keeping the interior 10 degrees cooler than the October air outside. It smelled of old sawdust, iron, and something else underneath, something dry and mineral that Fiona couldn't immediately name. She swept her flashlight across the space. Empty wooden shelving along the walls, a rusted hand truck, coils of old rope, and at the far end, stacked floor to ceiling, were dozens of unmarked cardboard boxes, the cardboard dark with age and moisture, several of them partially collapsed. In front of the boxes, blocking them, were 4 massive chest freezers, the old commercial kind, bolted to a plywood platform. They were unplugged. Fiona and Walter spent an hour moving the freezers. They used the hand truck and a length of rope, and at the end of it, they were both sweating despite the cold. When the wall of cardboard boxes was finally exposed, Fiona could see what was behind them. The back wall of the ice house was not concrete. It was drywall, painted to match, but where the bottom edge met the floor, decades of moisture had caused it to separate slightly. Fiona crouched and pressed her palm flat against the surface. It flexed inward. She ran her flashlight along the perimeter. There, along the left edge, the faintest outline of a door frame sealed with caulking that had dried and cracked. She used the crowbar from the boathouse. It took less time than she expected. The false wall was only 2 inches thick, a framed construction built against the original concrete. And when the crowbar found the gap and she leaned her weight into it, a 4-foot section gave way all at once, and Fiona stumbled backward into Walter's arms. They stood together, staring at what the flashlight revealed. Behind the false wall was a room, perhaps 15 feet deep, dug into the hillside and reinforced with rough-cut timber. The smell that hit them was old and dry and complex, machine oil, cedar, and beneath both of those something that Fiona's medical training identified instantly and involuntarily, the particular mineral smell of old bone. Lined against the left wall were steel storage cases, the military surplus kind, padlocked. On the right wall, shelves held rows of sealed canvas bags, some of them stenciled with numbers, several split open and exposing the tight-packed edges of currency bundles, old bills, the kind that hadn't been printed since the 1970s. And in the far corner, seated in a heavy wooden chair, as though waiting for someone to come and speak with him, was a human skeleton. It was clothed. The synthetic fabric of a 1970s leisure suit had survived better than anything organic. Its wrists were bound behind the chair back with rusted wire. On its lap, dropped between the radius and ulnar bones, was a hunting knife, still in its leather sheath. Fiona did not scream. She was a nurse, and she had seen death in many forms, and some part of her clinical mind engaged before the horror could. She held the light steady and stepped into the room. On the shelf nearest the door, she found what Agnes had meant her to find, a glass jar, the old Brazilian kind with a subtle seal, and inside it a roll of papers tied with kitchen twine, protected from the damp. Fiona lifted the jar out carefully, twisted the lid, and worked the papers free. There were 3 pages in Marion Belcourt's handwriting, small and precise, the pencil lines faded to grey. Fiona read them standing in the cold, her flashlight shaking slightly in her grip. In the summer of 1971, Marion Belcourt was 22 years old and working as a cook's assistant at Bellwood Lake Lodge. Agnes Bellwood, née Agnes Prefontaine, from Sturgeon Falls, had married Gordon Bellwood 3 years earlier and moved to the lodge to help run it. According to Marion's account, Gordon Bellwood was a charming, well-connected man who was also, beneath the charm, deeply violent. He had broken Agnes's left arm during a disagreement in the spring of 1971 and told the doctor in North Bay she'd fallen from the dock. Gordon, Marion wrote, was running contraband across the American border, untaxed cigarettes and liquor moving through a network of bush pilots and remote lakes. By 1971, he had accumulated what Marion estimated at several $100,000 in cash, which he kept in a room he had built himself, behind the ice house, over a winter when Agnes was visiting her parents in Sturgeon Falls. He had 2 partners in the operation, both from Sudbury. In August of 1971, Gordon murdered both partners during a dispute over the split. Marion was at the dock when she saw Gordon come back alone from a fishing trip, in a boat that had left with 3 men in it. She knew immediately. That night, she told Agnes. "We were afraid," Marion wrote, "but we were more afraid of what he would do when he realized I had seen." Agnes knew what Gordon was. She knew he would never let either of us leave with what we knew. We had 2 choices. We could run and he would find us, or we could act. Agnes had a garden. She grew lily of the valley along the north wall of the lodge, and in the root cellar she kept the garden books her mother had given her. Old books that knew everything about what grew in northern Ontario, and what it would do to a body if you weren't careful. He never suspected, Marion wrote. He trusted Agnes because he had always frightened her into trust. We put it in his evening tea, 3 nights running, and on the 3rd night he went down in the common room, and we put him in the chair, and we wired his wrists, and we built the wall. Marion had fled south to Barrie the following week, changed her surname, and never returned to Temagami. Agnes had stayed. Agnes had lived above Gordon Bellwood's bones for 52 years, running the lodge, maintaining the lie, that Gordon had taken the money and run somewhere warm, that she'd been abandoned, that she didn't know and didn't particularly care where he'd gone. Fiona looked at the skeleton in the chair. She thought of a 22-year-old woman and a 22-year-old bride, a murderous man collapsing onto a common room floor, and the particular courage it takes to build a wall and then spend half a century standing on the other side of it. He planned to kill us both, the last line of Marion's account read. We simply did it first. "She never told me," Walter said from the doorway. His voice was rough. "She never told me what was in here." He was quiet for a moment, but I knew she was afraid. I knew she watched that road every day of her life. Russell knows something is here, Fiona said. Russell's father was Gordon's cousin, Walter said. Grew up on stories about the money, about Gordon disappearing. His eyes moved to the skeleton. He's been circling this property for years. He'll be back tonight, Fiona. He didn't drive up here for a conversation. Fiona folded Marion's pages carefully and put them in her jacket pocket. She looked around the room, the currency bundles, the steel cases, the skeleton that had once been a man who killed his business partners and planned to kill 2 young women because they knew too much. The currency is seized goods, she said, thinking it through clinically, the way she triaged in emergency. Proceeds from the smuggling operation. It's been sitting here 50 years. There'll be legal complexity around it. She looked at Walter. The skeleton has to be reported. Yes, Walter agreed. And Russell can't get in here before the OPP do. Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled his phone out of his jacket and handed it to her. I've got a cousin in the North Bay detachment, he said. Call him directly. Skip the local switchboard. She made the call standing in the cold room, next to her grandmother's handwriting and a dead man's bones. What happened next moved at the speed of institutions slowly, and then all at once. The Ontario Provincial Police arrived before midnight. 2 vehicles, then 4, then a forensic unit from Sudbury that set up generator lighting along the access road and worked through the night. Russell Bellwood arrived 40 minutes after the first cruiser, in his Range Rover with the white pickup behind him, and spent a very uncomfortable 45 minutes in the back of a police vehicle, explaining what he'd been doing on private property at 11 p.m. The man in the white pickup, later identified as a private investigator Russell had retained, was found to have a firearm without proper transport documentation and was arrested on the spot. Russell himself was detained for questioning and released the following morning. But the process that followed, the forensic investigation, the probate proceedings, the scrutiny of his decade-long campaign to acquire the property, was not something that resolved quickly or quietly. The legal picture was genuinely complicated, and Gerald Holt, who proved considerably more capable than Russell had suggested, navigated it over the following months with real skill. The currency in the steel cases, $314,000, plus a quantity of silver bullion, had never been reported stolen from any identifiable source since the smuggling operation had been entirely off-book. After extensive review, the province of Ontario awarded Fiona a legal finder's fee that covered the full cost of the lodge restoration and left enough remaining that she didn't have to think about her bank account for quite some time. The skeleton of Gordon Bellwood was positively identified through dental records. The coroner's determination was complex, given the circumstances of his death 52 years earlier, and Marion and Agnes's role in it was reviewed at length. The Crown ultimately declined to lay charges. Both women were deceased. The evidence supported the self-defense account entirely, and there was no public interest in pursuing the matter further. Fiona stayed for her 45 days. She stayed for 45 days, and then she kept staying. She hired a contractor from New Liskeard to repair the main lodge roof before the first heavy snowfall. She spent her first winter there learning the property, the way the ice on Lake Temagami groaned and shifted in January, the particular cold of the Canadian Shield at -30, the fox that crossed the South Field every morning at approximately 7:15, and regarded her from a distance with profound disinterest. She gave Walter formal tenancy of the north cabin, in writing, for as long as he wanted it. He brought firewood without being asked, and was, in every way that mattered, the best neighbor she had ever had. She wrote to Gerald Holt in February and asked him to look into what records might exist for Marion Belcourt from her time in Temagami. Gerald found employment records from the lodge and, more significantly, a single letter in Agnes's personal papers that Marion had sent in 1972. 3 brief paragraphs saying she was settled in Barrie, that she'd met a man named Paul, that she hoped Agnes was well and sleeping better than she was. "I think about that summer every day," the last line read. "I think I will until I stop thinking entirely." Fiona framed that letter and hung it in the main lodge lobby beside the photograph of Agnes and Marion on the dock in 1971, both of them young and alive and squinting into the summer sun. In the first week of June, she reopened Bellwood Lake Lodge for guests. She had been a nurse for 6 years and understood precisely nothing about running a wilderness resort, which turned out to be both the hardest and most interesting problem she had encountered in her adult life. Walter knew the lake, the fish, the trails, and which cabins had which particular structural quirks that guests needed to be warned about. Fiona knew how to organize systems, remain calm under pressure, and speak clearly to people who were frightened or in pain, skills that transferred surprisingly well to hospitality. By August, they had their first solid review on a travel website. By September, they were booked through Thanksgiving. The morning the last autumn guests left, Fiona sat on the end of the dock with her coffee and looked out at Lake Temagami in the early light, the maples on the far shore burning the same orange and red they must have burned in 1971, when her grandmother stood somewhere on this same dock, understood what she was going to have to do, and did it anyway. She had come to Bellwood Lake Lodge for the money. She understood that about herself clearly and without judgment. She had been desperate, and the inheritance had looked like a rope thrown to someone drowning. But what she found inside the cold walls of that old log building was considerably more than money. She found Marion Belcourt, whom she had never known, and who had given her dark eyes, and she'd always believed, nothing else. She found the particular courage that survival demands of certain women in certain situations, and the knowledge that it ran in her blood. She found, in the most literal possible sense, where she came from. And she found that home is sometimes a place you've never been, waiting for you at the end of a bad road, looking like something broken, which turns out to be something that simply needed someone willing to stay long enough to fix it. Fiona risked everything on a phone call she almost didn't answer. So did Marion and Agnes, 52 years before Fiona was even born. So here's the question for you. If an envelope showed up in your mailbox tomorrow with your childhood address written in a stranger's hand, would you drive north to find out what it meant? Or would you throw it in the recycling and go back to the life you already know? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to Claim the Drama, because the stories that change everything are almost never the ones you see coming.